Chicago, summer of 2002. Humid air clung to the streets like a wet blanket, and the city pulsed with the hum of distant music, laughter, and the occasional honking of a cab. Kevin Miller, a 42-year-old retired cop, walked home from the corner store with a six-pack of beer. His days were uneventful now, a stark contrast to his decades on the force. As he approached his Hyde Park apartment, his mind wandered back to the years of adrenaline-fueled nights chasing suspects, solving cases, and feeling alive. Retirement had dulled him. Most nights, he sat alone on his balcony, sipping beer and watching the city move on without him. 3 miles away, Jessica Hart, 39, was locking up her family diner. Sweat dripped down her brow as she double-checked the register. It had been another long day, and her body ached from standing on her feet for 12 hours. The diner was her father's legacy, and keeping it afloat wasn't just a job. It was her way of keeping his memory alive. But tonight wasn't going as planned. As Jessica started her car, the engine sputtered and died. "Not now," she muttered, slamming the steering wheel. She popped the hood and stepped into the muggy night, staring at the tangle of wires. "And me need a hand," a voice called from the sidewalk. Jessica turned sharply, her pulse quickening. A man stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his demeanor calm but curious. "I'm fine," she snapped, though the frustration in her voice betrayed her. The man stepped closer, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Didn't mean to scare you. Just thought you might need help." Jessica hesitated. He looked harmless enough, early 40s, salt and pepper hair, and a face that seemed trustworthy despite the sharpness in his eyes. "Do you know anything about cars?" she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans. "A little," he said. "Mind if I take a look?" She stepped aside, and he leaned over the engine. "Starter's probably shot," he said after a moment. "You'll need a tow." Jessica groaned. "Just my luck. At least I'm stranded in the middle of Chicago and not on the highway." The man chuckled. "Silver linings, right?" He pulled a phone from his pocket. "I know a guy who runs a shop nearby. Want me to call him?" Jessica hesitated but nodded. "Sure. Thanks." "Kevin," he said, dialing. "Jessica." As they waited for the tow truck, the two exchanged small talk. Jessica learned that Kevin had spent 2 decades on the force before retiring early. He mentioned consulting work in private investigations but didn't elaborate. Jessica shared how the diner had been her father's pride and joy before his passing and how she'd taken over to keep his dream alive. The truck arrived, breaking the moment. As Jessica climbed into the cab, she glanced back at Kevin. "Thanks for the help. I owe you one." Kevin smiled faintly. "Be careful out there." The intriguing morning after Kevin couldn't shake the encounter. The next morning, he found himself standing outside Jessica's diner. He wasn't sure why he'd come. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just a break from his routine. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon wafted through the open door, pulling him in. Jessica spotted him immediately. "Morning, officer," she said with a smirk, setting down a coffee pot. "Retired," Kevin corrected, sliding into a booth. "Thought I'd see if your car survived the night." "It's alive and kicking," she replied. "Coffee?" "Sure. Black." Jessica poured the coffee and leaned against the counter. "So, you always rescue damsels in distress? Or was I just lucky?" Kevin chuckled. "Only when the timing's right." Their banter felt easy, natural. But Kevin couldn't help noticing the way Jessica glanced toward the door every few minutes, as if expecting someone, or something. A mysterious note that evening, Kevin returned to his apartment to find an envelope slipped under his door. No return address, no name, just a single folded note inside. "Stay away from her. This isn't your business." Kevin's brows furrowed as he read the words again. Who would send this? And why? He looked out into the hallway, but it was empty. Pocketing the note, he decided not to mention it to Jessica. Not yet, anyway. The next morning, Kevin returned to the diner. This time, Jessica was distracted. She moved quickly between tables, her smile forced. When she finally stopped by his booth, Kevin asked, Everything all right? Jessica hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, just a busy morning. But Kevin wasn't convinced. An unsettling encounter as Kevin left the diner. He noticed a man sitting in a car across the street. The man was watching the entrance, his gaze sharp and deliberate. Kevin slowed his pace, pretending not to notice, but the man's focus didn't waver. Back in his apartment, Kevin pulled out the note again. The warning suddenly felt more sinister. He decided to dig deeper. New routines and subtle connections. The following week, Kevin found himself returning to Jessica's diner every morning. He convinced himself it was just for the coffee, but he knew better. Something about her drew him in, her quick wit, her quiet strength, and the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Back again, huh? Jessica greeted him on the fifth morning, setting a steaming mug of coffee on his table. What can I say? I'm a creature of habit, Kevin replied. Jessica chuckled. Careful. Stick around too long, and I'll start putting you to work. You know how to flip pancakes. Not well, he admitted. But I make a mean scrambled egg. It became a ritual. Kevin would sit in the corner booth with his coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs, watching as Jessica ran the diner like a captain steering a ship through turbulent waters. She handled everything: difficult customers, an unpredictable staff, and the relentless demands of running a small business, with a grace that impressed him. But Kevin couldn't ignore the tension that occasionally flickered across her face. Sometimes, she would glance at the clock or the door as if bracing herself for something, or someone. A strange visitor one afternoon, Kevin stopped by the diner during the lunch rush. The place was packed, and Jessica was moving between tables with practiced efficiency. Kevin took a seat at the counter, nodding at her as she passed. That's when he noticed the man in the corner. He was older, maybe mid-50s, wearing a tailored suit that looked out of place in a diner. His sharp gaze followed Jessica's every move. When she approached his table, her demeanor shifted. Her confident posture faltered, and her voice dropped to a near whisper. Kevin strained to hear their conversation, but the clatter of dishes and chatter of other customers drowned it out. The man handed Jessica an envelope before leaving without finishing his coffee. When Jessica returned to the counter, Kevin caught her arm gently. Who was that? No one, she said quickly, avoiding his eyes. That didn't look like no one. Jessica sighed, pulling her arm free. Just an old customer. Let it go, Kevin. But Kevin couldn't. Uncovering the past that evening, Kevin sat on his balcony, turning the day's events over in his mind. The way Jessica had reacted to the man wasn't normal. She'd been scared, and Kevin had seen enough fear in his years on the force to recognize it. The note he'd received a few days earlier was still in his pocket. He unfolded it again, rereading the words, "Stay away from her. This isn't your business." Against his better judgment, Kevin decided to do some digging. The next morning, he called an old friend from the precinct. "Hey, Doug," Kevin said. "Need a favor." "What's up?" Kevin described the man from the diner in as much detail as he could remember. "Can you run a background check? Something about him doesn't sit right." Doug laughed. "You're retired, Kev. Why are you playing detective?" "Just a hunch," Kevin replied. A few hours later, Doug called back. "The guy's name is Vincent Russo," he said. "Loan shark. He's been in and out of trouble for years, but somehow always slips through the cracks." "Why are you asking about him?" Kevin's grip tightened on the phone. "He's bothering someone I know." "Thanks, Doug." Confronting Jessica the next morning, Kevin arrived at the diner early, catching Jessica as she unlocked the doors. "Morning," she said, forcing a smile. "Can we talk?" Kevin asked, his tone serious. Jessica hesitated, then nodded, letting him inside. Once they were seated, Kevin got straight to the point. "Who's Vincent Russo, Jess?" Her eyes widened, and she froze. "How do you know that name?" "I did some digging," Kevin admitted. "He's trouble, and I think you're in over your head." Jessica slumped in her chair, the fight draining out of her. "I didn't want you to know." "Know what?" Jessica sighed. My dad borrowed money from Russo years ago to keep the diner afloat. When he passed, Russo came to me to collect. I've been paying him off ever since. Kevin's jaw tightened. That's extortion, Jess. You don't owe him anything. I can't risk it, she said, her voice trembling. If I don't pay, he'll come after the diner or worse. Kevin reached across the table, his hand covering hers. You're not alone in this. Let me help. Jessica shook her head. You've done enough, Kevin. I can handle it. But Kevin wasn't convinced. The growing threat over the next few weeks, Kevin kept a closer eye on Jessica and the diner. He noticed the same car parked across the street several times, an old black sedan with tinted windows. It didn't take much to figure out who it belonged to. One evening, as Jessica closed up, Kevin waited outside. You're staying at my place tonight, he said firmly. What? Why? Because I don't trust Russo, and I don't trust that car that keeps showing up. Jessica sighed but didn't argue. That night, as they sat in Kevin's small apartment, she opened up about her father. He wasn't a bad man, she said quietly. He just made bad choices. He wanted to give me a better life, but it all fell apart. Kevin listened intently, his heart aching for her. You're nothing like him, he said. Jessica met his eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. Sometimes I feel like I am. You're not, Kevin insisted. And we're going to fix this. Together. A dangerous game. Kevin started digging into Russo's operation, using his old connections to gather intel. He learned that Russo was running an illegal gambling ring out of a warehouse on the city's south side. It was risky, but Kevin decided to confront him directly. Late one night, Kevin showed up at the warehouse. Russo was sitting at a desk, counting stacks of cash. Well, Russo said, leaning back in his chair. If it isn't the retired cop. What can I do for you, Miller? You're going to leave Jessica Hart alone, Kevin said, his voice steady. Russo laughed. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, I'll make sure the cops have enough evidence to shut this place down, Kevin replied. Russo's smile faded. You've got guts, Miller, but you're playing a dangerous game. Maybe, Kevin said, but I'm not afraid of you. The breaking point, the tension between Kevin and Russo escalated. One evening, Kevin arrived at the diner to find the windows shattered and graffiti scrawled across the walls. Jessica stood outside, her face pale. Russo, Kevin said through clenched teeth. Jessica nodded. He's sending a message. Kevin pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. We're going to end this, he promised. A glimmer of hope. Kevin went to the police with the evidence he'd gathered against Russo. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to put him under surveillance. Meanwhile, Jessica found support from her community. Regular customers pitched in to help repair the diner, and friends rallied around her. Through it all, Kevin never left her side. Revealing the intrigue, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Kevin discovered that one of Russo's associates had turned on him, providing testimony that could bring down the entire operation. With the police closing in, Russo agreed to back off in exchange for leniency. A fractured calm. Jessica thought the worst was over. With Kevin's help, Russo had backed off, at least for now. The diner was back to its familiar rhythm, the windows repaired, and the regulars filling the booths like nothing had happened. But a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Kevin, too, was on edge. He'd been a cop long enough to know that men like Russo didn't just let go. The threat had receded, but it hadn't disappeared. Things feel too quiet, Kevin said one evening as they sat in his apartment. Maybe that's a good thing, Jessica replied, though her tone lacked conviction. Kevin took her hand. Jess, if anything happens, stop, she said firmly. We're not living in fear. Not anymore. He admired her strength, but he couldn't share her optimism. The breaking point, the storm hit on a sweltering August night. Jessica was closing the diner when the familiar black sedan pulled up outside. She froze, her hand tightening on the keys. The door opened and two men stepped out. One was Vincent Russo himself, his slick suit gleaming under the streetlights. The other was a younger man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that screamed muscle. Jessica's heart pounded as she locked the door and stepped back. Her phone was in her pocket, but her fingers trembled too much to dial. Russo knocked on the glass, smiling as if this were a casual visit. "Jessica," he called out. "We need to talk." Jessica shook her head. "The deal was done, Russo. You promised." "Things change," Russo replied, his tone light but menacing. "Let me in, or my friend here might get impatient." Jessica's breath came in short gasps. She grabbed her phone and dialed Kevin, her voice a whisper. "Kevin, they're here." "Where are you?" Kevin asked sharply. "At the diner," she said, her voice cracking. "Stay inside. I'm on my way." A desperate defense. Jessica hung up and looked around for anything she could use to defend herself. Her eyes landed on a heavy metal rolling pin near the counter. She grabbed it and backed toward the kitchen, her heart hammering in her chest. Outside, Russo signaled to the muscle, who began kicking at the door. The glass held for the first 2 kicks, but the third sent it shattering inward. Jessica screamed as the man stepped through the broken frame, his boots crunching on the shards. "Stay back," she shouted, raising the rolling pin. The man smirked. "You're not going to use that." But Jessica didn't hesitate. As he lunged toward her, she swung with all her strength, the rolling pin connecting with his forearm. He howled in pain but didn't stop. Russo stepped into the diner, clapping slowly. "Impressive. But you're making this harder than it needs to be, sweetheart." Jessica darted into the kitchen, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She could hear Russo's mocking laughter as he followed. Kevin's arrival. Kevin's car screeched to a halt outside the diner. He took in the broken glass, the open door, and his stomach dropped. Without hesitation, he pulled his old service pistol from the glove compartment and rushed inside. "Jessica!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty diner. "Back here!" she screamed from the kitchen. Kevin moved quickly, his gun drawn. As he approached the kitchen door, the muscle stepped out, rubbing his bruised arm. "Who the hell are you?" the man growled. Kevin didn't answer. He aimed the gun squarely at the man's chest. "Step aside." The man hesitated, then raised his hands, backing away. Kevin kicked the kitchen door open to find Jessica cornered, the rolling pin still clutched in her hands. Russo stood a few feet away, his smirk vanishing when he saw Kevin. "Well, this is unexpected," Russo said. "The knight in shining armor." Kevin stepped between Russo and Jessica, his gun trained on Russo. "It's over, Russo. Walk away, or you'll regret it." Russo raised his hands mockingly. "Relax, Miller. I'm just here to talk." "Yeah," Kevin said, "because breaking and entering isn't exactly a conversation starter." Russo's eyes flicked to Jessica. "She still owes me, Miller. You think a little police work scares me? I've been doing this a long time." Kevin took a step forward. "Not anymore. You're done, Russo. I've got enough evidence to bury you. If you don't want to spend the rest of your life behind bars, you'll walk out that door and never come near her again." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Russo laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You've got guts, Miller," he said. "But guts only get you so far." Before Kevin could react, Russo lunged for him, grabbing for the gun. The 2 men struggled, the weapon clattering to the floor. Jessica screamed as Russo threw a punch, but Kevin dodged, slamming his fist into Russo's jaw. The muscle burst through the door, but Jessica didn't hesitate. She swung the rolling pin at his head, the impact sending him stumbling backward. Kevin wrestled Russo to the ground, pinning him. "It's over, Russo," he growled. Russo glared up at him, blood trickling from his nose. "You'll regret this, Miller." Kevin didn't flinch. "Not as much as you will." The revelation, the sound of sirens, filled the air as the police arrived. Kevin had called his old friend Doug on the way to the diner, and the cavalry had arrived just in time. Russo and his muscle were hauled away in cuffs, but Kevin wasn't celebrating. He turned to Jessica, who was slumped against the counter, shaking. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Jessica nodded, tears streaming down her face. I thought I thought it was over. Kevin pulled her into his arms. It is now. I promise. As the adrenaline faded, Jessica looked up at him. Why did you do all this, Kevin? You didn't have to. Yes, I did, he said, his voice steady. Because I care about you, and because you're worth fighting for. The final intrigue as the police cleared the scene, Doug pulled Kevin aside. Found something interesting, Doug said, holding up a file. Russo wasn't just after the money. He was looking for something specific. Something your girl's dad owed him. Kevin frowned. What are you talking about? Doug opened the file to reveal an old ledger. Turns out Jessica's dad kept records. Russo wanted them gone. Kevin's stomach sank. Where's the ledger now? Doug shrugged. No one knows. If it's still out there, someone else might come looking. Kevin glanced back at Jessica, who was talking to an officer. He knew their fight wasn't over, but for now they'd won this battle. Picking up the pieces, the diner reopened the next morning. Jessica stood behind the counter, watching as her regulars trickled in, filling the air with the familiar sounds of chatter, silverware on plates, and the hiss of the coffee machine. Yet, everything felt different. The memories of the night before lingered in her mind like smoke from a fire. Kevin sat at his usual booth, nursing a cup of coffee. Despite the bruises on his jaw and knuckles, he looked relaxed, as if nothing had happened. But Jessica knew better. Everything okay? She asked, sliding into the seat across from him. He looked up at her, his eyes soft but guarded. Shouldn't I be asking you that? Jessica hesitated. I don't know if it'll ever feel okay again. What if Russo wasn't bluffing? What if there's something else coming? Kevin reached across the table, his hand resting over hers. You're not alone in this anymore, Jess. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Her throat tightened, but she nodded. For the first time in years, she felt like she could lean on someone without fear of being let down. The ledger's mystery. Later that day, Kevin met Doug at the precinct. Doug had pulled the old ledger from evidence, the leather-bound book worn but intact. This is what Russo was after, Doug said, flipping through the pages. Kevin leaned in, studying the rows of handwritten entries. Looks like a list of names and numbers. Could be clients. Maybe debts. Doug nodded. It's more than that. Look at the dates. Kevin frowned, noticing a pattern. The entries spanned decades, some dating back to the 1980s. His eyes stopped on one name, Edward Hart, Jessica's father. Next to it was a figure that didn't match the other debts. It was significantly larger, marked with a red star. What the hell is this? Kevin muttered. Doug shrugged. Could be blackmail. Could be leverage. Whatever it is, Russo wanted it bad enough to risk everything. Kevin ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. If Russo wanted the ledger to destroy evidence, it meant the book held secrets that could still pose a threat to Jessica. A haunting realization that evening, Kevin returned to the diner with the ledger. Jessica was wiping down the counter when he walked in, his expression serious. Is everything okay? She asked. Not exactly, he said, setting the book on the counter. This is what Russo was after. Jessica stared at it. What is it? It's a record of debts, deals, and something more, Kevin said. He flipped to the page with her father's name. Your dad's name is in here, along with a figure I can't make sense of. Jessica's face paled as she read the entry. I don't understand. My dad always told me the loan was small, just enough to keep the diner running. Kevin hesitated. Jess, is it possible your dad was hiding something from you? Her jaw tightened. I don't know. He never talked about that part of his life. But if this is true... Kevin placed a hand on her shoulder. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. A voice from the past determined to find answers. Jessica went through her father's old belongings that night. In a dusty box tucked away in the attic of her apartment, she found letters, receipts, and photographs. Pieces of a life she barely knew. One photo caught her attention. Her father standing with a group of men in front of a sleek, black car. On the back of the photo, a single name was scrawled, Vito Russo. Jessica's stomach turned. She'd never heard her father mention Russo, but the connection was undeniable. Among the papers, she found a letter addressed to her father. The words were cryptic, but one line stood out. "The diner is a front. Keep it clean or we both lose." She sat back, her heart pounding. The diner wasn't just her father's dream. It was part of something much bigger, something dangerous. Unraveling the puzzle, Jessica showed Kevin the photo and letter the next morning. "I think my dad was involved in something illegal," she admitted, her voice trembling. Kevin studied the letter, his mind piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. "This explains the ledger. Russo wasn't just collecting debts. He was laundering money through your dad's diner." Jessica's breath caught. "No, that can't be true. My dad wasn't like that." "Maybe he didn't have a choice," Kevin said gently. "If he was in deep with Russo, he might have done it to protect you." Jessica shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I need to know the truth." Confronting the legacy, Kevin reached out to one of his former informants, a man named Manny who had ties to the Russo family. They met in a dimly lit bar on the south side of the city. "Russo's gone," Manny said, nursing a whiskey. "But his business isn't dead. There are people who'd kill to get their hands on that ledger." "Why?" Kevin asked. Manny smirked. "Because it's not just debts. It's dirt. Blackmail material on judges, cops, politicians, you name it. Your girl's dad? He was just the middleman. But if someone finds that ledger..." Kevin leaned forward. "What happens if they find it?" "They'll do whatever it takes to keep it quiet," Manny said. Kevin's grip tightened on his glass. He realized the danger wasn't over, it was just beginning. A final test 1 week later, a man came into the diner. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with an air of authority. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine as he approached the counter. "Jessica Hart?" he asked, his smile cold. "Yes," she said cautiously. "I'm here on behalf of some interested parties," he said. "They'd like to buy your diner. Name your price." Jessica stiffened. "It's not for sale." The man's smile faded. "Think about it carefully. Holding on to this place might not be worth the trouble." Kevin, sitting in the corner booth, had heard every word. He stood, his presence looming. "She said it's not for sale." The man glanced at Kevin, his expression unreadable. "Suit yourself." He left without another word, but his threat hung in the air. The ultimate choice that night, Kevin and Jessica sat in her apartment, the ledger open between them. "What do we do?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kevin thought for a long moment. "We give it to the feds. Let them take it from here." Jessica hesitated. "And what happens to the diner?" "To me." Kevin took her hand. "No matter what happens, I'll be here. You don't have to do this alone." Jessica nodded, the weight of her decision settling over her. A new beginning. The next morning, Kevin met with a federal agent he trusted, handing over the ledger. Jessica watched from a distance, her heart heavy but resolute. As the weeks passed, the diner remained open, and life began to return to normal. Kevin moved in with Jessica, their bond stronger than ever. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop overlooking the city, Jessica turned to Kevin. "Do you think my dad would have wanted this?" she asked. Kevin put an arm around her. "I think he'd be proud of you for fighting for what's right." Jessica rested her head on his shoulder, the weight of the past finally lifting. The final intrigue. Months later, Jessica received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, her father smiling, holding her as a baby. On the back, a message was written in familiar handwriting. "You were always worth protecting. Love, Dad." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the photo. Somehow, in the midst of all the chaos, her father had left her one final gift. A reminder that, no matter what, she wasn't alone. This conclusion ties every element of the story into a satisfying emotional arc, with intrigue and moral lessons woven throughout. It emphasizes love, resilience, and the courage to face one's past to build a brighter future. Vi skazala. Increase the ending by 500 words so that it is unexpected and people are shocked. Programa ChatGPT skazala. ChatGPT expanded ending. A shocking twist, a new chapter. The weeks after the diner ordeal felt almost surreal. Life began to regain its rhythm. But Jessica and Kevin both knew the shadow of the past wasn't fully gone. The ledger was now in the hands of federal agents. Russo was behind bars, and the menacing figure who had visited the diner hadn't returned. Yet, something lingered, a feeling Kevin couldn't shake. Jessica had thrown herself into restoring the diner's reputation, ensuring her father's legacy endured. The neighborhood rallied behind her, bringing an energy she hadn't felt in years. Kevin, ever watchful, supported her at every step. But beneath the calm, he felt the faint echoes of unfinished business. One evening, as they closed up, Kevin turned to Jessica. "Do you ever think about what your dad really wanted? I mean, all of this. Was it for you or something else?" Jessica leaned against the counter, thinking, "I've always believed it was for me. But after everything we've uncovered, I don't know. Maybe he had his own reasons, things he didn't share with me." Kevin nodded, the weight of those unanswered questions pressing down on him. A call from the past. A week later, Kevin received a call from Doug. "Kev, you need to see this," Doug said, his voice tense. "What is it?" "I thought we had everything on Russo and the ledger, but there's more. Something the feds didn't release." Doug met Kevin at a small diner far from their usual haunts, a stack of documents laid out between them. Kevin's stomach tightened as he read. The ledger wasn't just a record of debts, it was a roadmap. Buried among the entries were references to offshore accounts, coded messages, and one name that made Kevin's blood run cold: Eleanor Hart. Jessica's mother had died when she was a child, or so she'd always believed. But according to the documents, Eleanor had been a silent partner in Russo's operations decades earlier. The diner wasn't just collateral for a loan, it had been a front for laundering money long before Jessica's father took over. A shocking revelation that night, Kevin returned to Jessica's apartment, the documents clutched in his hand. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "You're late," she teased. "Long day." Kevin sat beside her, his expression grave. "Jess, we need to talk." She frowned, her playful demeanor fading. "What's wrong?" He handed her the documents, watching as she read. Her face paled, and her hands began to tremble. "This can't be true," she whispered. "My mom. She died when I was 8. My dad always said it was an accident." Kevin hesitated. "The evidence says otherwise. Your mom was involved with Russo long before your dad was. And her death. It might not have been an accident." Jessica's breath hitched. "No. My dad wouldn't have lied to me. He wouldn't have kept this from me." Kevin placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Maybe he was trying to protect you. Maybe he didn't know everything himself." Jessica stood, pacing the room. "If my mom was part of this, if she was working with Russo, then everything I've believed about my family is a lie." "It doesn't change who you are, Jess," Kevin said softly. "You're not responsible for their choices." Jessica stopped, her eyes brimming with tears. "But it explains so much. Why my dad worked himself to death to keep the diner afloat. Why he never talked about my mom's past. He was trying to fix her mistakes." A sudden threat before Kevin could respond. There was a loud knock at the door. Both of them froze. "Expecting anyone?" Kevin asked, his hand instinctively moving to his hip where his concealed weapon rested. Jessica shook her head, her heart pounding. Kevin approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood on the other side, his expression unreadable. "Who is it?" Jessica whispered. Kevin's jaw tightened. "Stay back." He opened the door just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" The man's voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Miller, I need to speak with Ms. Hart. It's about the ledger." Jessica stepped forward despite Kevin's protests. "What do you want?" The man looked at her, his gaze cold and calculating. "The ledger you handed over, it's incomplete. We believe your family may have hidden the rest." Jessica's stomach churned. I don't know anything about that. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. If that's true, you have nothing to worry about. But if we find out you're withholding information, well, let's just say Russo wasn't the only one who wanted to keep the past buried. Kevin stepped in front of Jessica, his voice low and dangerous. You've delivered your message. Now leave. The man nodded, turning to go. But before he walked away, he added, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, Miss Hart. Be careful. The truth comes to light. Jessica sat in stunned silence after the man left, her mind racing. What if he's right? She asked Kevin. What if there's more to this than we know? Kevin sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. There's only one way to find out. They spent the next several days combing through every inch of the diner, searching for anything her father might have hidden. Finally, in a false panel behind the counter, they found it. A second ledger, smaller but more damning than the first. Unlike the first ledger, this one contained detailed notes about Russo's operations, including names, dates, and transactions that implicated powerful figures in Chicago's political and business elite. Jessica stared at the book, her hands trembling. This is why they won't leave me alone. This is what they're after. Kevin nodded grimly. And now we have to decide what to do with it. A dangerous decision. Jessica and Kevin debated for hours. Turning over the ledger could put them in even greater danger, but keeping it wasn't an option either. In the end, they decided to anonymously deliver it to a trusted journalist. A move that would expose the truth without directly tying it to Jessica. The fallout was immediate. The story made headlines, sparking investigations and arrests that shook Chicago's power structures to their core. But for Jessica and Kevin, it was the beginning of a new chapter. A final goodbye. 1 week later, Jessica received another letter. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a handwritten note, signed only with an initial E. I made mistakes, but I loved you more than anything. Keep fighting for the life you deserve. Love, Mom. Tears streamed down Jessica's face as she read the words. Kevin pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. You okay? He asked softly. She nodded, wiping her eyes. For the first time in a long time, I think I am. A shocking twist months later, as Jessica and Kevin sat on the rooftop of her apartment building, watching the city lights flicker, a familiar black sedan rolled to a stop on the street below. Jessica tensed, her hand gripping Kevin's. Do you think it's over? She whispered. Kevin didn't answer right away. He watched as the car idled, its engine humming softly. Then, without warning, it pulled away, disappearing into the night. Maybe, Kevin said finally. But if it's not, we'll be ready. Jessica nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't running anymore. The past had tried to break her, but it had only made her stronger.